This is psych319, chapter 11, part 3. So now we're talking about syntax. Um, so syntax, the main job is to explain illegal versus legal sentences, not just word meanings, but sentences. And there are many sentences that can be combined using the same words, but they don't always make sense. So John resigned yesterday versus yesterday, or John resigned yesterday versus resigned John yesterday. The second one has all the same elements of the first one, except the structure, the syntax is wrong and it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. You can forget about translational grammar, but the idea that I'm trying to convey here is that sentences can be rewritten in many different ways, and some of those are legal and some of them are illegal. And sentence diagrams can be useful to illustrate which types of sentences are legal and which are illegal. So you can take any sentence and break it down into a number of subcomponents. Phrases, nouns, phrases, and verb phrases. So if you say John resigned yesterday, the noun phrase is followed by a verb phrase, which implies that John was doing something. Sentences that are broken down into something like noun phrase and noun phrase tend not to make sense because usually you want to imply some sort of action between one noun affecting another, one object affecting another. So in general, a sentence like this would be illegal because noun, noun, verb doesn't make much sense. And syntax reflect the idea that syntax reflects basic thought processes. If you took this sentence, the boy with the red shorts kicked the ball and scored a goal, you could break it down into various components, and I'm going to focus on this one right here. That you start off with a noun, something is doing an action to something else. Now these verb phrases are actually broken down into verbs and other noun phrases. So something did something here that affected something else, which also did something that affected something else. The boy kicked the ball and scored a goal. Something did something, did something, did something, and so on and so forth. And so it's reflecting the action or the sequence of events, and that's really what's going on with sentences, and you can visualize that using diagrams. So interestingly, a lot of musical phrases are composed in a similar way. So when you think about the story that we're trying to tell with this boy kicked the ball, it's made up of a subject, a verb, and an object. And the subject sort of sets up the background. Who was doing what? The boy. Sets the background of the story, and then there's some action going on. What happened? He kicked. And then a resolution. What did he kick the ball? And maybe something happened after that. Many musical phrases are composed of that same idea. You have an opening phrase with some type of static activity, and then a transitional musical phrase, and that implies action, and then a resolution. Think about happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you. That's kind of the background. And then you have this exciting transitional part in the middle. Happy birthday, dear psychology student. And then it resolves with happy birthday to you. If you think about it, all musical phrases kind of follow this general pattern. And what's interesting is it seems to be reflecting some basic fundamental way in how we communicate. It manifests in language and it manifests in music because they're both ways of communicating ideas and emotions. I'm going to have to skip over this, but it's an example from Mozart. You can find it at harmony.org.uk, and it's the same idea of taking a Mozart piano sonata and breaking it down into an opening section with dynamics and resolution. But I think my happy birthday example gives the same idea. Okay, now on to pragmatics, the social aspects of communicating language. So pragmatics are anything that is communicated in addition to the content of the sentence. So meanings can vary even if the sentence is exactly the same. I could say, you play the piano. Or I could say, you play the piano? The way I say it implies totally different things. One is sort of a factual statement. The second was, almost surprised, like, I'm surprised that you play the piano. I never knew. You're so talented. So we have to be able, using pragmatics, to distinguish between the following types of goals. And assertives, a statement of fact. Burritos are made with beans. Directives, a command, like get me a burrito. Commissives, committing to a future act, like yes, my lord, I will get you tasty burrito. Expressives, this burrito is tasty, and many others. So while I've used different sentences here, there might be an example somewhere out there of one sentence that actually could be used to sort of fill all of these, and the way you structure it or say it implies whether it's an assertive, directive, or an expressive. Some interesting stuff from language has come from the study of semantic priming. And this is a really kind of a difficult concept, but a very fascinating one. So take the sentence here. We walked over to the bank and took out some cash. Now, this asterisk in the middle implies this is a testing point here that we're interested. We're interested in the word bank. There's a famous study that was looking at how we process the word bank depending on the context of the surrounding sentence. If I only presented the first sentence, we walked over to the bank, you wouldn't know whether I was talking about a river or a savings and loan. The word bank is disambiguated. It's given its meaning at the end of the sentence. We walked over to the bank and took out some cash. This is from David Swinney in the 70s, and we call it the word priming effect. Remember the priming effect, the idea that certain words are paired based on frequency. When I say doctor, you say nurse. When I say Abraham, you probably think Lincoln, because they're frequently paired together. The presentation of a word speeds the reaction time to its pair if there's a strong association. So what you can do is you can read a sentence to a subject. We walked over to the bank, and then see how long it takes them to react to some other prime down the line. Okay, let's see. So what they found at the asterisk, if a person was given a visual task right here where they had to, where they were presented two words and decide which one went with the sentence, priming for river and money were equal. But if you waited till the end of the sentence, after the word bank, until you got cash, there was no priming for the word river, which means that at this point where the asterisk is, all possible meanings for the word bank are activated. That means the entire brain and all links to possible meanings of that word are activated until it's disambiguated. So reading all word meanings are processed until the correct meaning is required or identified. Access to the word meaning is effortless and automatic. It's fascinating. It's like your entire brain is working on this problem all at once, and it has all possibilities available to you until the point at which you really, really need it, which is at the end of the sentence. So you must be holding on to a lot of information until you reach the end of that sentence. I think I am going to skip over this part because it is fanciful and not necessary. I want to talk about a little bit about, and that goes for story grammar too. I want to focus on modularity. You can read those in the other slides. It's just word for word what I was going to say to you. Modularity is an important concept. It's the idea that language is a process that's separated from other cognitive processes. And this was a debate in psychology that went on for a really long time. The idea that speech is special. Is speech special? We didn't know for a really, really long time. Or is it just a manifestation of other cognitive processes? Is it just another way of thinking? Or is it its own thing? So when we say it's its own thing, we mean it's a modular process. And that could be a conceptual idea like when we talk about information processing, or it could be thought of in a neuroscience way that it has its own language brain area. And that also implies the differences between human and animals. Do we have a special speech center in the brain that other animals don't have? So support for the idea of modularity came from Swinney again. The fact that all possible word meanings are accessed at once implies that language is easy, it's automatic, that you have instant access to language and it doesn't require effort. And so you can walk and talk at the same time. You can talk while you're doing a complicated task because language is an effortless automated task. And therefore, if it's automated and it's not disturbed by other processes, it must be modular. It must operate on its own. And what's interesting, more support comes from brain damage patients. Patients with brain damage can lose language, but not their general cognitive ability. They might lose the ability to speak, but they can still think and reason. And then additionally, neuroimaging studies like MRI studies indicate that there are distinct language centers that operate and become active when you're doing a language task, but not while you're doing other cognitive tasks. So here again, back to this map of the brain, you have these critical language centers. And these don't necessarily light up for other cognitive tasks. So it appears that language is modular. Another concept I wanted to get across is lateralization. The idea that speech occurs in one hemisphere of the brain but not the other. So verbal behavior is largely processed in the left hemisphere, and the right hemisphere is mostly for spatial relationships. However, the right hemisphere is also involved in some thoughts related to speech, particularly where these two interact. Let's say you had to give somebody directions how to get somewhere. Well, the right hemisphere would do the mapping and mapping the spatial relationships, and the left hemisphere would process the language required for that task. But also, the right hemisphere is involved for emotional content and prosody. Prosody means the pacing of speech, whether a person is speaking in a particular flow. So, for example, if I ask a question, the inflections in the speech and the way I say something like, you play the piano, that inflection is very different from you play the piano, a statement. And a lot of the emotional content of speech happens in the right hemisphere. If you're being super sarcastic, for example, then the right hemisphere would become very active. So the left hemisphere lesions result in aphasias or language impairments, and the right hemisphere regions tend to result in problems with spatial relationships, math, and so on and so forth. Also, right hemisphere lesions result in problems with the ability to process the emotional aspects of language. You might be able to understand the content of what a person's saying, but if you have right hemisphere damage, you might not know whether it's a question or a statement, whether they're angry or sad, whether they're happy, or so on and so forth. I'm going to leave this, again, this last bit for your reading. It's a fascinating story in the main slides, but again, it's something that is just what I would, it's already written down, so I'm not going to go into it. These case studies are fascinating. I hope you check them out. And that is the end of part 3.